Our topic for today is the tragedy and triumph of the American city. So we're going to take a hard look at the American city, where the American city come from, and why does America have, I think, a really unique relationship to their cities, which I'll unpack very soon. So that's kind of our goal today. Our outline is this. We're going to start with this question. A lot of Americans hate cities, but yet we love cities too, right? So why is that? I think I want to especially focus on the hate part because this is one of the ways I think in which America is unique. Most of the world is getting more and more urbanized. America is not. We're going to talk about just a brief history. Cities have always been around, but their current kind of flavor or makeup is relatively recent. So we'll look at that. And then we're going to look at early 20th century, really the era when kind of urban problems really become pronounced. And we're going to look at some of the responses to that, and we're going to take a break. And then we are going to talk about one of the talkback articles you read, the one that I wrote, which I'll explain why I gave you something I wrote. And then for the second half of class, we're going to be spending most of our time. We're going to spend a very little time on this point and pretty much the whole last chunk on this. And again, I'll explain why I'm choosing this topic with the big idea. Some of America's best ideas emerge as a response to some of the worst circumstances. The progressive movement and early hip hop show this. Okay, so I want to start with some current events. Back when Donald Trump was president, there was a lot of kind of concern or discourse over some of the conditions at the border, right? There was some new policies put in place, particularly unpopular ones, family separation. And one particular congressperson, Elijah Cummings, who is in the House of Representatives, in DC, representing parts of Baltimore County and Baltimore City as well, was one of the more vocal critics of some of the conditions at the border. Now, Trump shot back by basically taking pot shots at Baltimore. Why is so much money sent to the Elijah Cummings district when it is considered the worst run and most dangerous anywhere in the United States? Again, he's talking about Baltimore City, right? No human being would want to live there. Where is all this money going? How much is stolen? Investigate this corrupt mess immediately. As proven last week, and this is him responding to the border, but again, he's taking pot shots at Baltimore again. As proven last week during a congressional tour, the border is clean, efficient, and well run, just very crowded. Cumming district, typo, is a disgusting rat and rodent infested mess. If he spent more time in Baltimore, maybe he would help clean up this dangerous and filthy place. So when, he was talking about a rodent-infested mess, he was talking about a place that hundreds of thousands of people, including myself, call home, right? So you can imagine that people living in Baltimore were not too happy with this at the time.
President Trump's facing widespread outrage after describing Baltimore as a, quote, disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess. Trump made the remark in a tweet attacking Congressman Elijah Cummings, one of the most prominent African-American lawmakers in Washington. Trump tweeted, Baltimore is, quote, considered the worst in the USA, and no human being would want to live there. Cummings, who chairs the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, has represented Maryland's 7th District, which includes parts of Baltimore, since 1996. Trump's initial tweets came after Fox News ran a story about Baltimore and after Cummings criticized the conditions of immigration jails along the Mexican border. Officials across Baltimore and Maryland denounced the president's remarks. The Baltimore Sun responded by publishing an editorial headlined, "Better to have a few rats than to be one." On Saturday, CNN anchor Victor Blackwell discussed Trump's comments about his hometown, Baltimore.
Infested. That's usually reserved for references to rodents and insects, but we've seen the president invoke infestation to criticize lawmakers before. You see a pattern here? Donald Trump has tweeted more than 43,000 times. He's insulted thousands of people, many different types of people. But when he tweets about infestation, it's about black and brown people. Infested, he says. The president says about Congressman Cummings' district.
Blackwell then choked up.
That no human would want to live there. You know who did, Mr. President? I did. From the day I was brought home from the hospital to the day I left for college. And a lot of people I care about still do. There are challenges, no doubt, but people are proud of their community. I don't want to sound self-righteous, But people get up and go to work there. They care for their families there. They love their children who pledge allegiance to the flag, just like people who live in districts of congressmen who support you, sir. They are Americans too.
There's a lot we could say about this. However, I start with this little story because I think this points to a larger dynamic in which a lot of Americans really hate cities, right? And here are just kind of a random smattering of headlines from these are all headlines that were published within the past few years, kind of demonstrating that Americans have a very complicated relationship with cities, and I think particularly Americans who don't live in cities look at cities with kind of disdain or fear, or just strong dislike. Now, the best way to capture this anti-city attitude is to look at population changes, right? Americans tend to vote with their feet. And Americans have been leaving cities pretty consistently since 1950. So again, here is a chart showing Baltimore's population loss. So at its height, Baltimore was just under 1 million people. And today, Baltimore has under 600,000 people, which I think this is the lowest we've dipped since like the early 20th century. And Baltimore is not an outlier. Pretty much virtually every American city, with the exception, I think, New York maybe, but even New York has been experiencing population loss, maybe not this dramatic, but just to compare and contrast. This is showing Los Angeles. This graph's a little more busy, but look at the light blue, right? That includes the urban part of Los Angeles. And the drop has been precipitous, and this is just showing since 2000, between 2011 and 2018. You can pretty much do this for almost any American city, and some are more dramatic than others. For example, Detroit, which actually is a city I really love, is near and dear to my heart. At its height was almost 2 million people in 1950, and now is 2/3 almost that size, right? So again, the population loss is dramatic, and this kind of makes the United States an outlier, actually, because the world in general is becoming more, not less, urbanized. So again, this is the global kind of human population. Obviously these are probably estimates, but even if the estimates are slightly off, overall it's pretty undeniable that the overall trend in the world has been the world becoming more urban, not less. And the United States, in a lot of ways, is going the opposite direction, right? Running away from cities. So to get a full handle on this issue, I think we need to, as usual, as we do in this class, start with history. So let's give a brief overview of the history of the American city. So in the colonial era, most early British settlements became cities. So for example, Baltimore, New York City, Boston, right? These are all early settlements that more and more people started coming to, and they just got bigger and bigger and eventually became cities. However, most Americans lived in rural areas, and this was the case for most of American history. And this trend continued until some things we'll talk about shortly. But first, I just, again, typical colonial city. Most colonial cities, Baltimore, Boston, again, New York City, were all on the coast, right? Because, this was a primarily kind of nautical culture. Obviously, boats were the best way to get around. And the early colonies depended on trade with Europe to survive. So it makes sense that most East Coast American cities that were founded in the colonial era, the vast majority of them are on the waterfront. So this starts to change in the early 1900s. So again, we go a few centuries with the trend being most Americans living in rural areas or small towns as well. So again, 100 years ago, like Towson, Catonsville, these are very small towns that were primarily in a kind of rural environment, right? So they were considered rural for the most part. So what happens in the early 1900s? Well, European immigrants and rural migrants, especially Black Southerners, start pouring into cities. By 1940, most Americans live in an urban area. So again, by the time we get to 1940, even earlier than that, America had become an overwhelmingly urban society. Okay, so this chart is using census data to just give us kind of a broad understanding of who was living in an urban area and who is living in a rural area. Now, one of the tricky things about this is that you might say, well, this kind of contradicts what I just said about America's leaving the cities. So in terms of population, suburban areas are often considered urban because of the suburbs are generally built around kind of urban areas, right? So in terms of census population, this is not contradicting what I just said about America's cities getting smaller. But and also the building of the suburbs kind of skews this because it's considered urban. But either way you slice it, there certainly was a time in history when America was mostly rural, and that starts to change in the early mid 20th century. Now, before continuing on, I thought it'd be interesting, just to make personal connections, to pull up some of your survey data, since the topic of this week is exploring some of the ways that place and cities versus suburbs, etc., shapes us. I thought it'd be fun to just show you some of the answers to this question. Where are you from? So let's start first with those of us from Maryland, and I've kind of arranged them alphabetically. So two of us identify as coming from Baltimore, one of us from Bel Air, which is in Harford County, Ellicott City, Olney, which is in Montgomery County, Landover Hills, which is PG County, Randallstown, Baltimore County, Rockville, and Silver Spring, both of which are Montgomery County. One is from Horsham or Horsham, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, which is outside of Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Frankenberg, and Nuremberg, Germany. One person said Lagos specifically, the other person just said from Nigeria. Seoul, Mapogu, if I said that wrong, I'm sorry, South Korea, Vietnam, and Sydney, Australia. So we are from all over the world. And I also just want to give you, so we already saw this data in the previous lecture, but I'm presenting it differently. So most of us have lived in the suburbs, about 50%, about 20% of us have lived in the country at some point, and about 36% of us have lived in the city. So again, as we're going through this lecture, I hope you're reflecting on how those different locations have shaped you. Okay, in addition to people coming, the other important thing is where people are ending up. The other important thing in terms of helping us understand where American cities are today, these growing cities were racially and ethnically segregated. So again, quickly remember that, I don't know what race means, I assume by now. Ethnically refers to typically like nationality, right? So we're going to find out there were lots of, kind of like what we now consider white people coming from parts of Europe that other people that kind of like established Americans didn't like, right? So we'll talk about that shortly. And new arrivals generally filtered into ghettos, which are areas already populated by folks like them. The word ghetto gets used sometimes today, and when it gets used is typically in kind of like a derogatory way. Typically if people say, oh, that's so ghetto, or you're acting ghetto, they're basically accusing a person of acting like a Black person from a city, right? So today it's not a very nice word. However, I'm using it as a historical term, which is a ghetto is a part of a city where people are either compelled or forced to live in because kind of the larger population doesn't want them, right? So let's talk about this a little bit, and let's just look at some of the groups that are coming. And again, overwhelmingly, these people are ending up in cities, right? And here are kind of the top kind of two categories of people, right? Are European immigrants and Black migrants, mostly coming from the South, looking for work and a way to escape, Jim Crow racism and find better labor than working on the farm, right? So again, here's just kind of the top four. African Americans, about 1.5 million Black people are filtering into cities during this period. So notice this is just up to 1929. This number would increase drastically in the 30s and 40s, but we're not there yet. People from Russia, mostly Jewish folks, fleeing persecution. Also, like Austria, Hungary is kind of a today they're like distinct countries, but at that time they were kind of a broad kind of ethnic area, also majority Jewish as well. And then finally Italians, who are majority Catholic. So every one of these groups, these are four very distinct groups and different groups. However, all of them are similar in that they were generally disliked, right? Black people for their race, and these other folks for their religion. But the point is, again, we'll get to that later. The point is, for now, generally speaking, the groups that are coming in large numbers are groups that people didn't want. So they ended up kind of being forced to live in ghettos, right? So why? Right? Why do we have ghettos? I think there's three main reasons, and I think all of these play into this story. So I just want to break down the three main reasons. The first reason is self-segregation, right? Human beings have a natural tendency to want to live near other people like them, right? I think that's just a vestige of whatever human nature or evolution, or for whatever reason, this is just the way human beings tend to operate, right? And there are evidence of this to this day in Baltimore. And again, if you don't know much about Baltimore, if you're not really interested in Baltimore, that's fine. I'm using Baltimore as an example because it's right near, it's right outside of UMBC, and you probably have some relationship to it, even if you don't really identify with it or go to it. So I'm just going to use some Baltimore examples here and there. So for example, there was a historically kind of Lithuanian section of Baltimore. So Lithuania is a small Eastern European country. It's pretty tiny in compared to Russia and some of the others, but there was like a sizable kind of population wave from Lithuania that settled in Baltimore. And, when, for example, Lithuanian people got here, they, created churches and neighborhood associations and, tried to recreate their cultural heritage and traditions in America. And to this day, the Lithuanian Hall is a building in a kind of downtown. I think it's kind of East Baltimore. I'm not really sure off the top of my head. Also, Little Italy. So if you've ever been, Baltimore's Inner Harbor, it's still kind of a touristy destination. Right outside the Inner Harbor, kind of across this big kind of street, is Little Italy, right? So why do we have Little Italy? Well, because when Italians got here, they were Catholic. They were disliked and looked down upon and seen as, a threat to, kind of Protestant America, right? So Italians, of course, generally speaking, started, were living next to each other because there was just safety in numbers, right? But that is not the main reason why we have ghettos. So let's look at the next two reasons. The next reason is something known as de jure discrimination. So de jure is a Latin for by law. So across the South, segregation laws separated white from black. And again, this is all history we all know, so I'm going to kind of brush over this. But de jure discrimination was essentially what one of the main targets of the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s, right? And Baltimore, being this weird town that's kind of between North and South, Baltimore was definitely Southern in terms of having segregation laws. We were kind of the northernmost city to have kind of overt racist laws on the books. So, for example, there was a law saying that if you were living in a majority white neighborhood, you couldn't sell or rent your house to a black person, right? That was in the early 20th century. Again, this was not just in Baltimore, obviously, it's all across the South. De jure discrimination was basically the norm in pretty much all Southern states. So this is, I believe, from Texas in the same era, kind of the Jim Crow era, right? So, and the laws might change depending on the racial and ethnic makeup of whoever was living in that part of the country. But this was the case all across the South. However, I think what was less appreciated is de facto discrimination, right? So outside the South, WASP-controlled governments and businesses use extra legal practices to achieve racial and ethnic segregation. So de facto just means in fact, right? So for example, Boston, Los Angeles, Detroit, right? There's all these cities outside the South that are extremely segregated in this time. Well, how are they doing it? Well, they're not passing laws, right? Because again, it's the North, and we're not racist in the North or whatever, or at least I think that's the historical myth. So they use extra legal practices. In other words, they figured out ways outside of writing overtly racist laws to keep cities segregated. And I think it's a really important point because, again, I think there's this myth that before the Civil Rights Movement, the South was segregated and the rest of the country was not. That is not true. America was segregated north, south, east, and west. It was just in the South, they were a little more effective and overt about it. Whereas virtually everywhere else in the country, de facto discrimination was very successfully racially segregated America's cities and towns. So let's talk about how. So I want to break down de facto segregation. There's a lot of ways they did it, but I want to break down three. And again, if you read the Unfair Housing Act's article, you're probably going to know some of these. But let's break a few down. So de facto segregation occurs outside of the law. Here are some discriminatory practices widely employed in and outside of the South in the early 20th century. So again, I'm kind of focusing outside the South. These were employed all across the country to make sure cities stayed segregated. So one of them was real estate ethics codes. So, then as now, there are people whose jobs it is to show houses to prospective homeowners and try to get a commission helping them purchase the house, right? So in the early 20th century, if you were a real estate agent, you basically had to adhere to an ethical code mandating against introducing diversity into established neighborhoods. Sometimes using contemporary language, they didn't use the term diversity back then, but basically, I'm going to show you the code in a second. It'll kind of make sense. So let me just continue on and we'll look at the code and I'll break it down. As a rule, they being real estate agents, only showed homes to prospective clients in areas that matched already established racial and ethnic patterns. So let me explain what I mean by this. So this is a snippet from the Realtor Code of Ethics, this is a voluntary code, but the vast majority of real estate agents virtually all adhered to it, right? And again, it was in effect from 1924 to 1950. So here's just some language from it. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. Right. So this was a big driver in white flight, right? Black people moving into our neighborhood, our property values are going down. Let's sell and get the hell out of here, right? And again, this was practiced outside the South, all over the country. Generally speaking, realtors, overwhelmingly most of whom were white, if they were working with a black client, they would not show them properties in white neighborhoods, and if they were working with a white client, they would not show them properties in black neighborhoods, right? So this is one of the ways that de facto segregation made America's cities racially segregated. Number two, policing. So this kind of brings us up to current issues, right? Policing has been was a big issue a few years ago. And policing has always been an issue related to race and kind of racial policies in the United States. So if you were a police officer in America through most of the early 20th century, you were expected, like part of your job, was to stop and question racial and ethnic others if they were found wandering outside of their neighborhood. And again, this is not, like the racist South, quote unquote. This is all across the country. For example, probably one of the most notorious examples of this is Los Angeles. For decades and decades and decades, the police were used as an instrument to, intimidate, prevent Black people from living in Black neighborhoods, in white neighborhoods, even just from like taking walks or crossing a line from their neighborhood into a white neighborhood. Now, again, this was not, if you became a police officer, you probably would not get your police manual saying, keep Black people out of white neighborhoods. So again, why? Well, this is de facto, right? This is de facto segregation. It's not written into law, but it is a social practice that very effectively is keeping America's cities segregated. There are lots of ways that de facto segregation is, right? These are just three, okay? But I'm intentionally picking three that I'm assuming that a lot of you never even thought of, probably, because this is not, this is not like super well-known history. And so the third is neighborhood associations. So neighborhood associations, they're still around today. So in Baltimore, there's a lot of, especially, the more wealthy neighborhoods have very active neighborhood associations. I unfortunately live in one that does not have an active one, but whatever. So neighborhood associations are not bad, right? They're just kind of like organizations to help try to improve or build leadership or whatever in a neighborhood. However, at that time, they were basically tools for segregation. So neighborhood associations were voluntary organizations who worked tirelessly to discourage homeowners from selling to racial and ethnic others, right? So, sometimes if somebody was leaving a neighborhood, they could sell their house to whoever they want to, especially if they weren't working with a real estate agent. And, in Baltimore in particular, every once in a while, a white person in a white neighborhood would sell their house to a Black person, and the neighborhood association would completely freak out and kind of go into high gear to try to stop this. If unwanted homeowners slipped through, residents would use protest and intimidation campaigns to encourage occupants to leave. And sometimes occupants left, sometimes they did not. And by intimidation, I mean like threats of violence and sometimes actual violence, right? So again, this is not a comprehensive list, but here are three examples of ways that de facto segregation made sure that segregation was the norm in America, Northeast, South, and West. Snippet from a newspaper. So at the bottom it says it's from 1907. The Baltimore Sun, which is still around, but but for a long time was the kind of most important newspaper in Baltimore. So this says, to check Negro invasion is the title of the article. Subtitle: Residents of Northeast Baltimore meet to protect themselves. Aroused by the large number of Negroes moving to their neighborhood, nearly 100 residents of Northwest Baltimore met last night in Watcote Methodist Episcopal Church, very Christian of them, right? Stricker and Pressman Streets, and formed the Neighborhood Improvement Association. So again, these associations are still around today. They're not overtly racist today the way they were, but in the early 20th century, this is one of their primary goals. And in fact, this article is actually saying that this neighborhood association was formed specifically to stop Black people from moving into this particular neighborhood, right? In terms of the kind of just life conditions and quality of life for Americans, the early 20th century cities were really, really, really bad. But again, in keeping with the theme, those conditions also inspired, I think, a really important movement that the progressive movement, which gave us a lot of kind of like basic rights and freedoms that we still enjoy today. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about in this section. This gives you an idea of how dramatically Baltimore grew since its very beginnings, right? With maybe a few thousand people. So that again, 1953, it seems like is the peak year when Baltimore got almost close to 1 million people. And again, today Baltimore has under 600,000 people, which has not happened since the early 20th century. So, but we're going to focus on this era here. So what was like living in places like Baltimore and other American cities at this time? Well, for most poor people, and this is, again, both poor immigrants from Europe and poor Black people, they were living in tenements, right? Which are basically multi-story apartment buildings with, kind of individual family residences. Now, while this, tremendous growth might have been good for, business, right? Big business especially, right? Because most of these people are coming and working in like factories. And it might have been good for like the tax base of the city. Generally speaking, these conditions were not good for the people living in them. So, for example, I want to play a video about the Tenement Museum. So the Tenement Museum, typically when people go to New York, if they go to a museum, they go to like, the Met or, the Science Museum or whatever. The Tenement Museum kind of flies under most people's radar. And if you're a museum person and you ever go to New York, I definitely recommend visiting it. Essentially, the Tenement Museum exists to kind of capture and like kind of remind people of what cities were like in early 20th century America. I'm going to pause here and play a little video. So this video basically starts out with a kind of current resident of New York City who is living in like a historic tenement apartment that hasn't really been updated, which is really fascinating. He seems okay with it though, as you'll see in the video. And then the kind of the video transitions from that to kind of a mini walkthrough of one of the sections of the Tenement Museum, just give you an idea of what life was like for people in early 20th century urban America.
I've been living in this apartment all my life. I was born and raised in this apartment. A tenement apartment looks like is your tub is in the kitchen. How do I take a shower? Take a shower with this, plug it into the sink, turn it on. Whoever's taking a shower or bath just tells everyone I'm taking a shower or bath. Everyone either stays in that living room or stays in a room. Hop in the tub, turn it on, and you're good to go. It fits. It's pretty comfortable. I grew up using this bathtub. I'm so used to it. It's kind of unique. We usually use the sink as much as we can, to brush our teeth, wash our hands, clean pots and pans. But there's times where, things don't fit in the sink, so we just use the tub. You can't stand. You're either squatting or you have like a small chair like this that we're sitting on right now.
One practical or logistical reason you might install a bathtub in a kitchen beyond the lack of available dedicated space for that would be the proximity of plumbing already there for running water via a sink in the kitchen. So we're standing in the kitchen of the recreated home of the Baldizzi family, who were Sicilian immigrants who called this building home in the early to mid 1930s. What's interesting, I think, is you could see here, this is a really good example of how in this kitchen you not only have a tub, but as you can see, also used as a countertop to prepare meals. When 97 Orchard Street is built in 1863, there are no toilets inside this building. The toilet facilities are actually in the rear yard outside in the back of the building. The 1901 Tenement House Act required that toilets be brought inside a building. And what that resulted in here is a toilet, a water closet. 2 of these per floor. There are 4 apartments per floor, so you're sharing a toilet with your neighbor and their family. Tenement, really since the middle of the 19th century, if not shortly before, have been the predominant form of housing for the majority of New Yorkers, particularly working class and immigrant New Yorkers. Despite the fact that living in tenement apartments was often challenging, that residents still worked to make a life for their families and themselves here.
Now, if you thought the living conditions were bad, you should look at the working conditions. So typically when we think of factories, right, we think of, huge kind of industrial plants in an industrial part of a city or like an office park or something, However, in the early 20th century, most factories were just run out of like apartment buildings, basically. And these were known as sweatshops, right? Why were they known as sweatshops? Well, because again, they were poorly ventilated. They were super, super hot, especially in the summer. And they were just generally not nice places to work. And here is a map from 1922. Let me just hide myself here. It's kind of hard to see what's going on, but basically, it's very hard to read these. But what we see here is different categories. So we have women's wear, men's wear, food products and tobacco, metals and metal products, etc., leather goods, right? So all these different kind of forms of manufacturing, right? And then we see here a map of various places where these factories were located. And again, if you know New York City well, right here is Manhattan. This is the touristy part everybody goes to. It has, Times Square, Broadway, all that stuff. And look at how many factories were in there. Now you can see some larger factories. These were probably like standalone warehouses, in an era before regulation, before ventilation, before fire codes in particular. This caused a lot of problems. And the best example, or kind of, I would say the most tragic example, I won't say the best example, of the dangers of these sweatshops is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So quickly, shirtwaist, it's not a word we have today. A shirtwaist was a type of clothing that was popular in the early 20th century. And basically, there was a tragedy at this one particular factory in 1911 that really kind of galvanized support for something known as the progressive movement, which had been around for a while and had been advocating for changes to a variety of things, including workplace conditions.
New York City, early 20th century. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied several floors of a Manhattan business building called the Ash Building. It was located just off Washington Square Park, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was, by almost any definition, a sweatshop. It was a densely packed place. Some 500 people worked there, and the work schedule was punishing. 11 to 12 hours a day, every day. Most of the people employed at the factory were young immigrant women, teenagers even, who didn't speak English. These women sat at long tables, day in, day out, sewing shirtwaists. Shirtwaists were mass-produced blouses. They resembled men's shirts and were very popular with working women. So here's what happened. March 25th, 1911, Saturday evening, the end of the workday, the work week. A fire started in a bin of cotton scraps, perhaps from a cigarette butt. A manager tried to use a hose to put it out, but the hose valve was rusted shut and the hose itself was rotted away. The factory floor didn't have a sprinkler system, so the fire spread quickly. People panicked. The building had only one flimsy fire escape, and it wasn't nearly big enough. It collapsed. The building had 4 elevators, but only one was working, and it only held 12 people at a time. It managed to make 4 rescue trips before it broke down. Some desperate workers jumped to their deaths down the elevator shaft. Workers tried to take the stairs, but the exit doors only opened inward, and they were kept locked by factory management. Many people were crushed to death trying to get out. Firefighting technology hadn't caught up to the new tall buildings of a city like New York. The fire hoses and ladders could only reach the 7th floor, 1 floor short of the fire. Dozens of desperate workers jumped out of the windows. They chose to die from the fall instead of the flames. Other workers burned to death or died from smoke inhalation. The whole episode lasted just 18 minutes. 144 people were dead. 2 more died later in the hospital, bringing the death toll to 146. Until the events of September 11th, it was the deadliest workplace disaster in New York City history. Days later, on April 5th, a massive funeral protest march took place on 5th Avenue in Manhattan. More than 350,000 people were in attendance. The factory owners, Max Blanc and Isaac Harris, were indicted for manslaughter, but were declared not guilty in their trial later that year. Yet, long after the flames died out, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire served as a cautionary tale that helped to redefine the American industrial workplace. The fire was a key moment in the growth of labor unions, particularly the ILGWU, or International Ladies Garment Workers Union. New York City passed measures including the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, which required sprinkler systems to be installed in all factories. It served as a model for state and national workplace safety codes. These measures made American workers safer, but they were too late for the workers who perished one terrible March day at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
Okay, so let's move now from the problem to the solution for the time. So again, urbanization resulted in the rapid growth of substandard housing, and should add substandard working conditions for the urban working classes. Journalists and social reformers spread awareness and struggled for change, arguing that political action could improve human society, and progressivism was born. So progressivism had been around since kind of the late 1800s, but really ramps up in the early 20th century. And I think before I kind of go over some of the victories of the progressive movement, I just want to give you one little example. One of the targets of the progressive movement was food safety, right? And there was a really famous book called The Jungle, written by a guy named Upton Sinclair, that basically shone a light on this issue of both the conditions in which people had to work in the meatpacking industry, as well as the quality or lack of quality in the actual food.
On the morning of February 10th, 1906, as Wiley was busily preparing for the coming battle in Congress, the American public awoke to the shocking headlines about a scandal within the meatpacking industry. Newspapers were filled with stomach-churning details of the filthy conditions of Chicago's largest beef companies, as described in a damning new book called The Jungle by novelist Upton Sinclair. Sinclair had spent nearly 2 months working undercover, documenting the inhuman labor practices and unsanitary conditions on factory floors. Stories of rat infestations, widespread contaminated and diseased carcasses, and even of human appendages finding their way into processed meat and onto grocery store shelves.
The Jungle was not written as an argument for safe food legislation. It was written as an argument on behalf of workers' rights, but it had unintended consequences. There were a number of scenes in the novel about rats, getting into the meat and being turned into sausage, about how filthy the conditions were, and Americans were eating a lot of meat.
There were stories of people distracting the inspector who was there to check for tuberculosis in cows, so that cows that they knew were tubercular could just be passed through and end up in the cooling cars.
The book describes mold-covered meat that's washed off in a bath of borax and then goes back into the food supply. The walls are scummy with rotting meat that is dried and blood spattered and germs are growing everywhere.
You have the fresh cuts of meat on down to the pieces of meat on down to the scraps of the pieces of the spoiled meat. And they're all going into different products and being canned and sold to different populations who are completely ignorant of what is or isn't going into their food.
It was a portrait of an industry run amok, an extremely worrying depiction of America's food supply that transfixed the country. I aimed for the public's heart, Sinclair recalled, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach.
What did the progressives want to do? They had two very, very broad and overlapping agendas. One was curbing the excesses and abuses of industrial capitalism, right? This was the era of kind of the type of kind of global capitalism that we now know today was really kind of coming into being. And yeah, it was making a lot of people a lot of money, but there was a lot of concern that the people who were making that money, basically for the wealthy, were being abused and mistreated. The other was improving the lives of the urban poor, right? So again, this is kind of like workplace and also just kind of general, social life and human thriving, right? Now, this is an important point. Progressives were products of their time. Many in this overwhelmingly white middle-class movement supported racial segregation, immigration restrictions, and the eugenics movement. before getting into this and unpacking this, I just want to again start with a video, just give you an overview, and then I'll kind of pull out some important points from the video.
So the Gilded Age was the period when American industrial capitalism came into its own and people like Mark Twain began to criticize its associated problems. Then the Progressive Era was the age in which people actually tried to solve those problems through individual and group action. As the economy changed, progressives also had to respond to a rapidly changing political system. The population of the US was growing and its economic power was becoming ever more concentrated, and sometimes progressives responded to this by opening up political participation and sometimes by trying to restrict the vote. The thing is, broad participatory democracy doesn't always result in effective government, he said, sounding like the Chinese National Communist Party. And that tension between wanting to have government for, of, and by the people and wanting to have government that's like good at governing kind of defined the Progressive Era, and also our era. But progressives were most concerned with the social problems that revolved around industrial capitalist society, and most of these problems weren't new by 1900, but some of the responses were. Companies, and later corporations, had a problem that had been around at least since the 1880s. They needed to keep costs down and profits high in a competitive market. And one of the best ways to do this was to keep wages low, hours long, and conditions appalling. Your basic house elf situation. Just kidding, house elves didn't get wages. Also, by the end of the 19th century, people started to feel like these large monopolistic industrial combinations, the so-called trusts, were exerting too much power over people's lives. The 1890s saw federal attempts to deal with these trusts, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, but overall, the federal government wasn't where most progressive changes were made. For instance, there was muckraking, a form of journalism in which reporters would find some muck and rake it. Mass circulation magazines realized they could make money by publishing exposés of industrial and political abuse. Many progressives were concerned that industrial capitalism, with its exploitation of labor and concentration of wealth, was limiting rather than increasing freedom, depending on how you define freedom, of course. Industrialization created what they referred to as the labor problem, as mechanization diminished opportunities for skilled workers and the supervised routine of the factory floor destroyed autonomy. The scientific workplace management advocated by efficiency expert Frederick W. Taylor required rigid rules and supervision in order to heighten worker productivity. So if you've ever had a job with a defined number of bathroom breaks, that's why. Also, Taylorism found its way into classrooms, and anyone who's ever had to sit in rows for 45-minute periods punctuated by factory-style bells knows that this atmosphere is not particularly conducive to a sense of freedom. Now, this is a little bit confusing because while responding to worker exploitation was part of the progressive movement, so was Taylorism itself, because it was an application of research, observation, and expertise to the vexing problem of how to increase productivity. And this use of scientific experts is another hallmark of the progressive era, one that usually found its expression in politics. American progressives, like their counterparts in the green sections of Not America, sought government solutions to social problems. Germany, which is somewhere over here, pioneered social legislation with its minimum wage, unemployment insurance, and old age pension laws. But the idea that government action could address the problems and insecurities that characterize the modern industrial world also became prominent in the United States. And the notion that an activist government could enhance rather than threaten people's freedom was something new in America. Now, progressives pushing for social legislation tended to have more success at the state and local level, especially in cities, which established public control over gas and water and raised taxes to pay for transportation and public schools, whereas federally the biggest success was like prohibition, which, you know, not that successful. But anyway, if all that local collectivist investment sounds like socialism, it kind of is. I mean, by 1912, the Socialist Party had 150,000 members and had elected scores of local officials like Milwaukee Mayor Emil Seidel. Some urban progressives even pushed to get rid of traditional democratic forms altogether. A number of cities were run by commissions of experts or city managers who would be chosen on the basis of some demonstrated expertise or credential rather than their ability to hand out turkeys at Christmas. This tension between government by experts and increased popular democratic participation is one of the major contradictions of the progressive era. The 17th Amendment allowed for senators to be elected directly by the people rather than by state legislatures, and many states adopted primaries to nominate candidates, again taking power away from political parties and putting it in the hands of voters. But many progressives wanted actual policy made by experts who knew what was best for the people, not the people themselves. And despite primaries and direct elections of senators, it's hard to argue that the progressive era was a good moment for democratic participation, since many progressives were only in favor of voting insofar as it was done by white, middle-class Protestant voters. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. Progressives limited immigrants' participation in the political process through literacy tests and laws requiring people to register to vote. Voter registration was supposedly intended to limit fraud and the power of political machines. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar, but it actually just suppressed voting generally. Voting gradually declined from 80% of male Americans voting in the 1890s to the point where today only about 50% of eligible Americans vote in presidential elections. But an even bigger blow to democracy during the Progressive era came with the Jim Crow laws passed by legislatures in southern states, which legally segregated the South. First, there was the deliberate disenfranchisement of African Americans. The 15th Amendment made it illegal to deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but said nothing about the ability to read, so many southern states instituted literacy requirements. Other states added poll taxes, requiring people to pay to vote, which effectively disenfranchised a large number of African American people who were disproportionately poor. The Supreme Court didn't help. In 1896, it made one of its most famous bad decisions, Plessy versus Ferguson, ruling that segregation in public accommodations, in Homer Plessy's case, a railroad car, did not violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. As long as black railroad cars were equal to white ones, it was a-okay to have duplicate sets of everything. Now, creating two sets of equal quality of everything would get really expensive, so southern states didn't actually do it. Black schools, public restrooms, public transportation opportunities, the list goes on, would definitely be separate and definitely not equal.
Okay, so over the roughly 3 decades that the progressive movement, kind of like 1890 through the 1920s, for the roughly 3 decades the progressive movement was active, it scored some really, really important victories, which again, regardless of your political persuasion, today, if you're more conservative, even the word progressive might put you on on alert. However, I think regardless of your politics, there are certain things that the progressives accomplished that we still enjoy today, and again, regardless of your political persuasion. For example, progressive activists successfully convinced Congress to amend the Constitution to include a clause about the direct election of U.S. senators. So again, today, if you've ever voted before, if you plan on voting, every few years, we decide who represents us in Congress, us being whatever district you live in. Each state gets 2 senators. And for a long time, senators were not chosen by direct election. In fact, if you look at the Constitution, it pretty clearly says that. So originally, this is Article 1, which talks about the Senate. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof, right? So in other words, each state, so, state of Maryland, in Annapolis, right, where the Maryland government sits, has, a House of Representatives of local state representatives and local state senators. So for most of history, it was the state legislatures who decided which 2 senators are going to represent that state, right? So this changed. Here is the 17th Amendment. It's very short and to the point. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote, blah, 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 blah. The rest is important, just not important for what we're talking about today. So this is a significant victory of the progressive movement. Let's look at some more. Minimum wage laws. For most of human history, or excuse me, for most of American history, employers could pay their employees whatever they wanted to. That changes with the kind of creation of national federal minimum wage laws. Food safety laws. Today, if you buy something off the shelf, you can see what ingredients are in it, right? You can see the nutritional value, a lot of other things. That kind of tradition of knowing what's in our food begins here. There were almost no laws governing food, particularly meat packing, right, as we saw from that video, and thank God, right? It's disgusting. Housing or building codes. Today when you build a house, it has to be, ventilated, it has to have so many windows, right? There's all these like local codes that each, have city or county or state has. We have the progressive era to thank for that. Abolition of child labor. This idea that like kids should go to school and graduate high school and stuff, right? That's a really new idea. In the early 20th century, especially if you're a poor immigrant family, your kids worked, right? Because you had to work because you were poor, because you didn't have minimum wage laws, because you didn't have labor unions, right? And eventually people were like, no, like 70-year-olds should not be working in dangerous factories for 12 hours a day. And that gets abolished. Child labor gets abolished in this era. The 40-hour work week. You can thank for that. Again, people used to work 12-hour days for sometimes 5-6 days in a row in the early 20th century. Also, the labor union movement, which, again, if you're more conservative, this is more controversial. But, labor unions, in a lot of ways, are one of the primary reasons why middle-class Americans could afford to move into the suburbs, because they, by the time of the 1940s and 50s, white Americans had several decades of working in kind of industrialized, unionized jobs that were really well paying, right? Lastly, women's suffrage. So again, suffrage means the right to vote. So with the passage of the 19th Amendment, across the country, and again, at this time, certain states let women vote, most states did not. So that changed in, I believe, 1919. Yes, I am right. 1919 is when this gets passed. And here's, again, very short, sweet, to the point. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And any state is important because a lot of states hated this and were angry and saw this as a violation of, the separation of powers and federalism and all that stuff. But too late, it's in the Constitution. And Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So in other words, just kind of leaving it open that, like, if Congress wants to pass laws specifying how this plays out, that they could. So progressive era is a big deal, right? And again, I think regardless of your politics, regardless of what you think about the modern progressive movement, some people have very strong feelings about progressives today, and that's fine. I think these are things that most of us, these are just basic rights and expectations we have, right? We expect our food not to be poisoned. We expect children not to have to work in factories. We expect, that if you work more than 40 hours, you get paid overtime. However, not all was rosy, right? And unfortunately, and I think, if we're going to fully contend with the progressive movement, we have to talk about some of the ugly parts of it. The progressive movement was also deeply linked with something known as eugenics. So what was eugenics? Well, eugenics was a progressive pseudoscientific movement. So by pseudoscientific, meaning there were people who, had advanced degrees in eugenics and, were teaching university classes in eugenics and stuff, right? All why? Well, because it was quote unquote scientific. Eventually, people realized this is not real science, this is junk science, and moved away from it, but we're not there yet. So it was a pseudoscientific movement advocating for the quote-unquote genetic improvement of the human race. It sought to limit procreation of bad populations. So what are bad populations? Well, non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? And so, Black people, Jewish people, poor, Italians, poor Irish folks, etc. Prison inmates, and folks with mental illnesses. And biased immigration laws.
The anxieties about urbanization, about unlettered, untutored, relatively uneducated peoples coming in large numbers, the sense that disease was a problem, all of these worries were amalgamated into a belief that immigrants caused these problems, and thus immigration should be held down.
Many white Protestant Americans came to fear they were about to be outnumbered and outbred by the newcomers and their offspring, that they were being replaced. They embraced a new pseudoscience born in Britain called eugenics, which falsely claimed, with no evidence, that everything from poverty to prostitution, disabilities to what they called feeble-mindedness, could be eliminated if the individuals they dismissed as socially defective could be stopped from reproducing.
I wish very much that the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding. And when the evil nature of these people is sufficiently flagrant, this should be done. Criminals should be sterilized, and feeble-minded persons forbidden to leave offspring behind them. Theodore Roosevelt.
The idea was that the bad people have to stop reproducing, and the good people need to reproduce more. Negative eugenics says sterilize the wrong people, snuff them out. And that's the eugenics that the Nazis would pick up on.
Colleges and universities taught eugenics. Medical societies confirmed it. Clergymen preached it. John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie funded it. And some of the most prominent people in America championed it. Margaret Sanger, Alexander Graham Bell, even Helen Keller.
It seems to me that the simplest, wisest thing to do would be to submit cases like that of the malformed idiot baby to a jury of expert physicians. If the evidence were presented openly and the decisions made public before the death of the child, there would be little danger of mistakes or abuses. We must decide between a fine humanity and a cowardly sentimentalism.
33 of the 48 states would eventually enact eugenics laws mandating the forced sterilization of wards of the state deemed physically or mentally unfit. People in prisons, hospitals, and asylums. More than 60,000 Americans would be sterilized without their consent before the last of these statutes was removed from the books in 2014.
This image here is again just showing it's kind of a cartoon illustrating some of these beliefs. So eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution, right? And if you look down here, you see words like biology, psychology, mental testing, anthropology, right? Archaeology, right? So again, like there is this strong feeling that this was like good, real, actual science. Like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into an harmonious entity. And you know, this was not fringe stuff. This was like really kind of like popular mainstream stuff. You know, so there were, you know, public relations campaigns. There were not so much on the federal level, but there were certain states that really embraced eugenics and used, you know, forcibly sterilized various populations they didn't like. And why? Well, again, you know, the language is very lofty. It was like, we're doing this for the good of the human race, right? Only healthy seed must be sown. Healthy seed, they're talking about like sperm, basically, right? Check the seeds of heredity disease and unfitness by eugenics. So unfitness was a word that was popular in the eugenics movement to basically say that like this person shouldn't procreate, right, for various reasons. And you know, there were like popular magazines spreading these ideas. Shall we breed or sterilize defectives? Again, this is such ugly language, but you know, this is America. Like we're probably used to this by now. Like there is a casualness to the kind of racism and classism and kind of despising of various populations throughout American culture that is just part of our history. And unfortunately, as I'm sure some of you know, eugenics was, you know, again, it was a fringe thing and it got less and less popular throughout the 20th century. However, it did a lot of damage. Eugenics was one of the kind of pillars that the Nazis used to, you know, justify, you know, killing Jewish people and gay people and illnesses, etc. So, you know, again, this was not fringe stuff. This was it was not just an American, it was an international movement, right? Now, the Holocaust really like made a lot of people realize that eugenics was terrible, and by kind of the 1960s, eugenics had pretty much disappeared. There's still some fringe people who believed it, but it's kind of been resurrected today by some people in the hard right, which you can just Google that if you don't believe me. All right, so quick reminder, we started by talking about, you know, kind of why, like how and why Americans hate cities. And then looking at just the early history of the city, right? America went from being a mostly rural to a mostly urban nation. And largely that it happened through migration and immigration. Then we looked at life in the early 20th century American ghetto, you know, how rough it was and challenging. But at the same time, some, I think, positive things that happened for the progressive movement, although positive but not uncomplicated things, right? With the whole eugenics thing. And again, reminder, this is kind of why we're doing this, right? This is not a comprehensive look at the history of the American city. We're just kind of dipping our toe in a little bit to kind of what we call urban studies to see that some of America's best ideas emerge as a response to some of the worst circumstances. I think the progressive movement, you know, I don't want to sugarcoat it, like despite some of the more problematic and gross aspects of it, I think at least shows that there are times when great crises are met with, I think, great movements. So let's kind of pause here and reflect a little bit. Post a signed response. Again, by signed response, I mean put your name on it so I know it's yours. To the main Lionel board to one of the following questions. I got 3 questions, just pick one. If you did not grow up in an urban environment, how might your life be different now if you had? So fun thought experiment. Next question. Many American cities are more segregated today than 100 years ago. Why is de facto segregation still an issue? And then the third question is just kind of a general kind of thought or analysis of the progressive movement in general. So what lessons can modern social movements learn from both the successes and the racist excesses of the progressive movement, right? So again, the progressive movement did some great things. They did some very harmful things. And is there a lesson to be learned there for some modern social movements? So maybe think of a social movement from the past few years that you relate to, maybe the MAGA movement or Black Lives Matter, depending on your politics or whatever. What can these social movements learn from both the victories and the kind of the ugly parts of the progressive movement? So again, pick one of these three, post. I'm looking forward to hearing and reading your thoughts, and we will move on to the next topic after my little break. Okay, for the second half of the class, we're going to kind of do two things. One is we are going to kind of connect things happening in the early 20th century to kind of things happening now, right? And we're going to take a step out of the city because, again, you can't understand kind of urban history without also understanding suburban history, right? Because the building of the suburbs had some very, very particular effects on the city, which we'll talk about briefly. And then we're going to spend most of the second half of this class doing a little case study. Again, kind of build around this theme of sometimes like the best ideas come from the worst situations. And I think hip hop is a really good example of that. Again, whether you're a fan of hip hop or not, just the story of where hip hop came from is one that I just think more Americans need to know. It's just a really great story. And it's one of my favorite things to teach on. So, wanted to end on something kind of hopeful. And I want to start by just referencing the article you read for your talkback, Unfair Housing Acts, How Government Policies Segregated the Baltimore Metropolitan Area, written by me. Now, I wanted to say, last semester when I assigned this, I had one student kind of like accuse me of being self-promoting for making you read this article. So I just wanted to say why I had you read it. I think there's I think a few main reasons. One, I find that most students are actually curious about what professors do outside of class. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, well, reason number two is not really a reason, it's more of a qualification. This is not monetized, so I didn't make any money off of you reading this article. And then, but I think the main reason I had you write it, or had you read it, excuse me, was because I wrote this article because I felt like there was not an article like this out there. There are lots of great articles on redlining. You can find articles about housing, about fair housing issues. You can find articles about the building of the suburbs. And I wrote this article because I wanted one that kind of put all of these different things together into a kind of a narrative, and specifically a narrative about the Baltimore metropolitan area. So I assigned this to you not because I think I'm like particularly amazing and you should read my writing. I assigned this because this was a piece of writing that I think needed to be out there, and if someone else writes something better, then I'll assign that in the future. But but either way, I hope it was interesting and enlightening and infuriating, because as it should be. And what I'm going to do is, this section is going to be pretty short. I just want to do two things. One, I just want to play a video. So this video is going to reiterate but also I think recontextualize some of the things I talked about in my video. So if you've never seen Adam Ruins Everything, Adam Ruins Everything, it's kind of started as like a comedy video series. And basically in this video, the host Adam takes a lot of things that are kind of near and dear to people's hearts and kind of does a quick history lesson as to why that maybe the picture is more complicated than it was originally. So there is a certain kind of dark humor that I really appreciate that you might not, which is, if you don't think this video is funny, that's fine. I understand why. But again, I think this video will do a good job of summarizing and also extending some of the things dealt with in the reading. So I'm going to play the video afterward. I'm just going to make a few points and then we'll get to hip hop. Okay, so the reading in the video, both of them together had a lot of information and not all of it is relevant. So let me just highlight what I think is important for your notes. So 3 points. First point is this, and again, how racism built the suburbs in 3 points. One is realtors used color-coded maps to judge whether home loans would be risky or safe. Again, these color-coded maps were made by the federal government in the 1930s. Majority Black and brown urban areas were redlined, so that's practice one is redlining. Meaning banks could or would not offer home loans in those areas. Most urban redline areas are still majority Black and or brown and poor, right? So again, this is a redlining map from New York City. Again, just to show you that this was not just our area, right? The denial of financial and real estate services to those living in undesirable areas is a practice that shaped the housing market for decades. And this was national. So here's Baltimore's redlining map. Here's New Orleans. Here's Los Angeles. There are websites today that like historical websites that curate these, and you can pretty much pick any city in America in the mid 20th century that has more than 100,000 people, right? or some, less even in some cases. And Google, city name redlining map, and you'll find it pretty easily. Which is why, to this day, no matter what city you go to in America, there are certain parts of those cities that are majority Black and brown, majority poor, and most of those areas were redlined during the early 20th century. So these patterns persist, even though they happened a long time ago. Next point, and we've already seen this before, so I'm going to brush over this. Suburban housing covenants mandated that homeowners not sell or rent their homes to non-white people. And I showed you an example before, but here's another one, again, just so you know that that example I showed you was not a one-off thing. I don't remember what part of the country this is from, but it says right out, racial restrictions. No property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. And then it goes on to say you can have a domestic servant. But again, these were all over the country, in the vast majority of suburban communities that were popping up in the suburbs after World War II. Now, after the Civil Rights Movement, abolished a lot of these practices, right? So there was something known as the Fair Housing Act, which was part of a larger civil rights bill, which essentially, abolished redlining, abolished housing covenants, abolished, real estate agents being just overtly racist, right? So after that happened, Black people started moving out to the suburbs, and in a lot of cases, white people started moving even further out, right? So after the Civil Rights Movement abolished overtly racist housing practices, white suburbanites demonstrated a general tendency, not always again, but a general tendency to self-segregate, so that's number 3, and move further out as non-whites moved in. So for example, if you go to Northwest Baltimore County, there's a section called Randallstown. Randallstown is majority Black. If you took a time machine back 60 years ago, you would see the opposite. You would see majority white and Jewish, right? So in a 30-year period, Randallstown in particular went from virtually all white and Jewish to all Black between 1970 and 2000. Now, it's not all Black today, but if you went to the school, you would not know that, right? So, and I should know from personal experience, this is a shot from Randallstown High School's website. When I graduated from college in the early 2000s, I was an art teacher at Randallstown for 3 years. Randallstown was a majority Black school. I think we literally had 2 white kids, like I'm not exaggerating, and a tiny handful of Asian kids. But again, 30 years ago, this was an all white and or all Jewish school. Why? Well, again, because after the Civil Rights Movement outlawed these things, de facto segregation persisted and persists to this day, right? In fact, kind of northern liberal cities today are probably more segregated now than they were before the Civil Rights Movement. So now we're going to move into the last section. We're going to look at hip hop. But before we do that, just, I think we've kind of seen that, in this this is very broad. We're skipping over a lot of details, but hopefully you now see and appreciate kind of the overall evolution of the American city over the past 100 years, right? Started out things pretty rough. Some things got better, but then a lot of people left. And in general, the only people that were left behind were majority non-white, majority poor people who, for a variety of reasons, were stuck in these areas that had been redlined that by the time we get to the 1970s were very poor, very non-white ghettos, right? And I think it is from that context that we get hip hop culture. So let's move into a little more specificities. We're going to move away from Baltimore. We're going to move away from kind of just general urban trends across America, and we're going to look at the South Bronx. So I want to start this section by asking this question. What words, images, and ideas come to mind when you hear New York? Over the years, as I've asked this question, students have answered this in different ways. Some people say crowded, some people say rich, some people say, touristy, some people say rats or subway, right? There are various things that we associate with New York City. However, as long as I've been teaching this kind of material, I never once have had a student answer my question this way by saying the worst city in America, right? However, if you took a time machine back to the 1970s and you asked an average American, even Americans who had never even stepped foot in a city, Americans living in very rural environments, well, what is the worst city in America? Overwhelmingly, people would have said New York City, and here is why. Large parts of New York City, in particular the South Bronx, as we're going to talk about, were unbelievably abandoned, destroyed, crumbling, falling apart in ways that looked like a war zone. Times Square was not Disneyland, as someone in the video I'm going to play soon says. Times Square was notoriously filthy. There was drugs and sex work and porn palaces all over the place. It was not this like family-friendly destination. And homelessness, poverty, crime. New York City was not what it is today, not this like glitzy, fancy, touristy destination. New York City was absolutely in free fall. The city was bankrupt. And again, at that time in America, New York City, just the city itself, just saying New York City was a metaphor for everything Americans hated and despised about cities at the time. So to drive the point home, I'm going to play a clip from a documentary. This documentary it's actually specifically about the emergence of three really important American music genres that come from New York at the time: punk, disco, and hip hop. We're just going to focus on hip hop. And by the way, I teach a class called American Music and Culture where we deal with in depth with all three of those and kind of how New York kind of birthed these really important and influential American music genres. However, the purpose for me playing this clip is just, again, to give you a sense of what life in New York City was like from the words of the people who live there.
The first to die by the killer's gun was 18-year-old Donna Lauria last July. 6 months later, Christine Freund became his second victim. He struck 6 times, and police say they're nowhere near solving the case.
In '77, Son of Sam was running around and shooting people. Everybody was scared to death.
In 1977, we had soaring murder rates. We had a city that was really gripped with every form of crime.
The city was dirty. It was experiencing an epidemic of arson. It was covered in graffiti.
The city was so broke that city services had been cut back profoundly.
They laid off 5,000 cops.
They closed firehouses. They laid off thousands of teachers.
Nobody knew from day to day whether the Big Apple would become the bankrupt Apple.
You had to really hold on to your purse. There was an element of danger, but it was also wonderfully sleazy.
Times Square wasn't Disney World. It was prostitution and pimps.
It was great. It was like the Wild West. And it didn't cost anything to fucking live here.
1977 was the year of the 25-hour citywide blackout that led to massive looting and in fact, the largest mass arrest in the city's history.
And New York City went through one of the most contentious mayoral elections in 1977. And it came to be seen as an election for the soul of the city in the future.
People were confused, disillusioned, afraid. All of these emotions were spawning all kinds of music.
That was the year that disco exploded in New York.
Back in '77, we took hip-hop from the South Bronx, brought it into the club. We never thought it would blow up like it did.
Yeah, 1977 was a big year for punk rock.
There was a buzz at CBGB's. Everybody wanted to sign punk bands.
It was no coincidence that during this period of really kind of ultimate decay for New York, it was an incredibly exciting place to be.
It was free, it was open, you felt like you could do anything you wanted.
Most people thought that New York City's great days were over. My attitude was, fuck them.
Okay, quick geography note. So when we say New York City, we are talking about 5 areas that are considered all part of the same city, right? Manhattan, Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. Manhattan is the part everybody knows. It's the touristy part. Times Square, Broadway. All of that stuff is there. Typically, if you visit New York, that's where you spend your time. However, what is some of the boroughs are kind of less well known. I think the Bronx is certainly one of those. The Bronx, right north of Manhattan, and the South Bronx in particular. As you see in this map, is a section of the Bronx where hip hop came from. And I think it's really important that we understand the scene in the South Bronx and understand the incredible poverty. Because, if New York City was considered the worst city in America, quote unquote, at the time, the South Bronx was considered the worst part of the worst city in America for reasons that we'll unpack in the next slides. So first thing to say is that the South Bronx was heavily redlined. You can see this is the northern part of Manhattan here is heavily redlined. This is a majority black area, Harlem, etc. And the South Bronx, this is virtually all of the South Bronx was redlined or yellow lined. So yellow lined is like a step above redlining, but it was still pretty bad. Basically, it was basically saying this is like a poor, mostly non-white area, right? And white flight really hit the South Bronx hard as well. So here is the population change for the South Bronx. As you can see, between 1970 and 1980, the South Bronx lost almost half of its population, right? Not quite half, but hundreds of thousands of people are leaving the South Bronx. The vast majority of people who are leaving are white people, or kind of black and brown middle class people who can afford to leave, right? So when all the people with resources leave, who's left behind? Well, people who can't afford to leave, right? So the desperate and deep poverty in the South Bronx is something even today is hard to imagine. And I think the pictures I'm about to show you and some of the realities I'm about to explain, I think will drive that home, right? So here's just some stats. Between 1970 and 1980, the Bronx lost almost 50% of its population, right? I already said that. Certain neighborhoods lost 50 to 97% of its buildings to abandonment or fire. So just wrap your mind around that. I mean, imagine living in a neighborhood where 50 to 97% of the buildings over, several decades had been destroyed by fire, right? So that's why if you just Google South Bronx 1970s, you'll find picture after picture after picture that look like this, right? Well, why? Well, again, mostly because of the fires. Now, why were there so many fires? We'll talk about that in a second, but let's keep going with this part. Roughly 60,000 manufacturing jobs had disappeared. So again, in the early 20th century, immigrants could or migrants from the South could come to the cities and get factory jobs. They were dirty, they were dangerous, but after the progressive movement and unionization and safety standards, those jobs, even though they were rough, paid really well, right? And those jobs are one of the ways that millions of people were able to move into the middle class during the 1940s and 50s. However, for people trapped in cities, those jobs are largely gone by the 1980s, right? Because of deindustrialization, because of jobs going overseas to places like China, because of robots replacing jobs, etc. And the South Bronx is historically a very working class part of New York City, and was hit really hard by those jobs disappearing. It also has the highest concentration of poor minorities of the 5 boroughs, and that's the case today. So just quick comparative analysis. So this is showing the makeup of Manhattan in 1980. Again, this is from the U.S. Census. Manhattan at that time, which again, is to this day the wealthiest part of New York. It's where Donald Trump is from, etc. Is at that time was still majority white, right? Now, by contrast, the Bronx. This is the Bronx overall, not just the South Bronx. Was majority black and brown, and again, majority poor black and brown. And by again, the time we get to 1980, several 100,000 people had left, and the people who were left, regardless of their skin color or race, were very poor and facing social circumstances that were far worse than even what the rest of poor people in New York City were facing. These pictures are devastating. Like, I find these pictures hard to look at. Just this kind of destruction and decay is just unimaginable. Even in some of the poorest cities, the poorest parts of like West Baltimore, even today, don't look this bad. A large part of this devastation is because of fire, right? You can kind of see that the side of this apartment building is kind of dark. This is fire damage. This is fire damage inside of this building, it looks like. So why? Why did the South Bronx look like this? Again, the fire epidemic, I think, was unique to the South Bronx. There are other poor black and brown parts of New York that were experiencing this problem to this degree. So let's kind of unpack this a little bit. I think the best way to do this is for me to pause and just show you this video to give you an idea of the scope of it.
We grew up in rubble. We grew up with burnt out decay all over us.
The Bronx looked like a war zone. Every day there was a fire. And I was right in the middle of it.
This South Bronx had over 500,000 people. And when it was all over, might have been 150,000 people.
It was sort of a normal situation. There was a fire. You ran and you went to watch it. I mean, that's what we did. I didn't understand that we didn't have to live that way. How could city government allow this to happen? Who was in charge? Why?
The city of New York and the government picked up the rug, swept the South Bronx under the rug, and dropped it, and didn't look back.
The city was virtually bankrupt. They make cuts in the places where there would be the least protest.
After these cuts, fire damage rates were astronomical.
Buildings kept getting abandoned, people kept leaving. Every day you'd walk out of your house and you'd go to school and you see an abandoned building here, an abandoned building there. It was done quickly and it happened fast, and it was almost like a plague.
In my household, what we wanted to do was to get out. But I remember saying, this is where I'm from, and I have to make sure I never forget that that's where I came from.
I hope that video affected you. I mean, I think, you know, one of my goals in this class is for us to connect to human beings living in completely different circumstances than our own. And this is a circumstance I've never had to deal with, and I'm assuming most of you, maybe none of you have ever had to deal with. And I think that video did a good job of just humanizing this. What the video didn't say, however, is the why, right? So why were there so many fires? Why was the Bronx burning? The primary reason was because of this. Landlords frequently paid people to burn their empty buildings to collect insurance money. That was the primary reason. There are other reasons, you know, just angry, disaffected kids with just nothing to do. That was certainly a part of it, but this was the primary reason, right? Well, why? Well, if you lose 300,000-400,000 people over a period of 10 years, and you're a landlord, there's just not enough people to live in your apartment building and pay you rent. And you know, you can make more money paying some, you know, kids in the neighborhood some remember organized crime or whatever, you know, basically like getting someone to set a fire so that you can collect the insurance money. And that, again, was the primary reason. And unfortunately, as the video said, in classic American fashion, since there were so many fires and since there was so much poverty, they cut the fire department, right? Because as we do in America, right? Unfortunately, so which just exacerbated the problem as well. So by the time we get to the era of hip hop, the Bronx just was destroyed and devastated and disadvantaged in a way that is hard for most Americans today to understand, right? But again, there were kids living here, right? As there are kids living everywhere. And, you know, just think of your childhood. Think of, you know, and maybe you had a great childhood, maybe you didn't. You know, imagine what it was like growing up in this kind of environment, right? So and I think that's an important question today, right? What happens to young people living in deeply disadvantaged environments where, you know, violence and decay and destruction and neglect are just part of your everyday life, right? Well, unfortunately, some of those kids, you know, don't turn out so well, right? Particularly when you consider the fact that poor communities are less likely to have, you know, well-funded schools. They're less likely to have youth programming, and they're less likely to have kind of nonprofits, you know, churches and stuff that offer youth groups. If you grew up in a church in the suburbs, you know, you probably had like an awesome youth group and they probably took you on ski trips or whatever, right? That's generally not happening for small, struggling, you know, churches and youth organizations in urban areas. So there's just less for young people to do. There are all kinds of positive things in wealthy and well-resourced communities for kids to do after school and on the weekends and during summers, right? But as hundreds of thousands of people are living in the South Bronx, as the tax base is disappearing, jobs are disappearing, wealth is evaporating, and youth programming was hard to come by as well, right? And then as now, there's just less positive things for kids to do. And unfortunately, conversely, there are more negative things for kids to do. So gangs have been around since forever, right? In the 1970s, you know, Black and Puerto Rican in particular gangs in the South Bronx were not a new thing. However, what was a new thing was that most in the early 20th century, most street gangs were often like formed for protection. You know, minorities coming together in various communities to protect themselves from groups of other people, either white people or other minorities who were trying to hurt them for you know various reasons. However, in the 1970s, this is really when kind of American urban gangs start quote unquote professionalizing and becoming more and more and more involved in and really dependent on the drug trade. And again, gangs had been around for a long time, but the kind of gangs that emerged in America's inner cities in the 1970s were particularly fierce. And also, since drugs were involved, they were often fighting each other over economic territory, right? And this is also causing the violent crime rate to skyrocket in the 1980s and 90s as well. So, things were rough and grim for a lot of young people living in these environments. However, I don't want to overgeneralize and stereotype. Not every young person then or now living in, a disadvantaged urban area joins a gang. And just as many, if not more, do not, right? And go on to beat the odds, graduate high school, and so in a lot of cases go on to college, be productive citizens. However, these people, I think, are really beating the odds, right? People who come from really, really poor urban environments and do really well for themselves, I think, are extraordinary humans, to be completely honest. But I think it's in this vein that, yeah, there are young people who go a certain way and there are others who don't. I think this is the best way to introduce hip hop, right? Because hip hop was essentially, in my view, a response, a kind of creative celebratory response to the worst possible conditions that at that time an American could probably be living in, right? I think it's so important to understand, again, whether you like hip hop or not, that this form of music, which now, love it or hate it, is kind of the basic form of global youth culture in the world, not in America, in the world, that this cultural movement comes out of the worst city in America and the worst part of the worst city in America under circumstances that would make most of us just absolutely lose our minds if we had to live in those environments, right? So let me unpack this a little bit and show you kind of the specific ways how extreme poverty shaped early hip hop culture. So I want to illustrate this with a little thought experiment. Imagine you are a kid who likes art. Well, guess what? If you live in the South Bronx, you're probably going to public schools, and your public school is probably failing and poor because, again, public schools are, financed from property taxes in your area. If your area is poor, your school is poor, and that is the case today, unfortunately. So again, if you're a kid in the public school system who likes art, your school probably does not have a very good art program, right? Or even an art teacher at all. So what do you have access to if you like art? Well, you have access to kind of the refuse of industrial capitalism, like, kind of industrial art supplies, right? Spray paint. And, you have access to maybe some hardware stores that you can either buy or steal it from. And you have access to walls and subway cars and other things, right? So again, if the structure of society, the public school system in particular, is not supporting your interest in art, well, guess what? You're going to figure out ways to make art maybe outside of those structures, right? And that is where graffiti comes from. And by the way, graffiti is kind of the first manifestation of what would eventually come to be called hip hop culture. So let's kind of continue with this thought experiment. If you're a poor kid, you probably can't afford an instrument or are less likely to afford an instrument. Your school is less likely to have things like marching bands and orchestras and things like that. And your school is less likely to be able to afford instruments as well. So what if you're a musical person? What do you have access to if you can't afford instruments? Well, you do have access to, your grandfather or your mom's old record collection. And actually, at this time, records were still like the main form of music. So I guess these weren't old necessarily at the time. So anyway, you do have access to your parents' record collection. And you do have access to public spaces like parks, basketball courts. And hey, you can set up your parents' record player and get some old crappy stereo speakers and play records in the park, right? And this is where hip hop music comes from. Literally, entrepreneurial DJs playing records in public spaces, and as we're going to find out, doing interesting things with records. So let's keep going with this. If you're into dancing, you probably can't afford dance lessons. Your school almost definitely does not have a dance program, but you do have access to cardboard. Right? You're like, okay, what does that have to do with dancing? Well, cardboard basically created an open air outdoor dance floor for street dancers to perfect their moves and create something known as breakdancing. Last point. if you're, if you're a public high school student who's into like literature and writing and poetry and things like that, right? You're probably not getting the best instruction in your overcrowded, oftentimes out of control English, high school English class, right? But you do have access to pen and paper, and you can make your own poems and rhymes. And eventually, with hip hop culture, you can take those poems and rhymes and perform them publicly in front of people who are dancing and partying in the face of all of this despair and misery and suffering, to your very lively and spirited rhymes, right? So this is where hip hop comes from, and this is why I say, whether you love hip hop or not, if you want to understand this cultural movement, you have to put it in the absolute dire poverty, right? Literally, hip hop is kids taking just the crap lying around, right? The crap that society is giving them and turning it into something beautiful. And which is, again, this is why I love the story of hip hop, because I think it is at its core, it is a celebration of life, and choosing joy, and just in the face of just absolute dire poverty. So let's unpack this a little more and look at the particulars of how early hip hop culture played out. So when you put these together, historians, actually people then and now, would note that these disparate movements, so graffiti being kind of the visual art component, DJing and MCing being the musical component, breaking dancing being the kind of physical like dance component of hip hop, they all kind of appear at roughly the same time. And sometimes people don't understand how graffiti fits in. It's just part of this cultural movement of kids using whatever is at their disposal to make something beautiful and creative. And a lot of early graffiti artists were also MCs or were also breakdancers, right? So the culture all kind of coalesced roughly at the same time in the mid 1970s. So let's dig into this culture more and try to kind of really understand it. So again, as I said, graffiti was just in terms of the public consciousness, graffiti was kind of the beginning of hip hop culture. Kids using particular kind of like industrial paint products, spray paint, to make first signatures and later more elaborate murals on walls and on subways, and on other kind of public venues that were just available to them. So again, this was the first time kind of the beginnings of hip hop culture really bubble up. And the second phase was kind of when people started doing interesting things with records at block parties and house parties. So block parties and house parties was kind of an old tradition in urban America, not just Black America. People using public spaces for kind of communal celebrations and dance parties and things like that. However, what happened with hip hop was that some of the folks who were doing these block parties and house parties, and again, I'm going to say too, there was a financial component to this, right? If you're a DJ with a really interesting record collection, you're often charging people to come to your dance parties. Again, if it's in public, it's a little harder, but like some of these were in like halls of like public housing project, had like meeting halls and stuff like that. So people were DJs were making money off of this, throwing these parties and charging people to get in. However, some DJs started doing some really interesting things that eventually led to the creation of hip hop music. So what was that? Well, it was this. They figured out how to take two records and do something called extend the break. So let me kind of break this down and explain what this is. And I think the best way to do that is to introduce you to a particular individual. DJ Kool Herc is considered by many to be the godfather of hip hop. So he was the first person to really start doing interesting things with records that influenced other people to do interesting things with records, which eventually led to rapping and some other things, right? So what was it exactly that he did? Well, let me actually start by playing a video that will kind of explain it a little bit, and after the video, I'll kind of clarify some.
And the system came out in a big park, and he rocked the park, you know what I'm saying?
It wasn't called hip hop when I was doing it. It was called a jam. Coming to the jams.
But the thing about Kool Herc, he played a lot of stuff. Like he was a DJ who played records that you never hear on the radio. That's what he was. You know what I'm saying? A lot of break beats, a lot of hot break beats and all that.
Breakbeat was a term used for old funk records where the music broke down to a bare rhythm. Herc would take instrumental breaks from different records and mix them together non-stop. Other DJs soon picked up on the technique.
I figured out, like, to every great song, there's a great part. And a lot of times, you know, that part could have been 10 seconds. That really used to piss me off. Like, you know, best part of the record is where the drummer finally gets a moment and the rest of the band members is just taking a coffee break. So why can't this be 5 minutes? So I had to figure out a way to take this particular passage of the record, repeat that, but also add percussive noises and repeat it and sort of like do some manual editing to it. Kind of like do things to the record that the record just kind of like just should have had.
So to kind of explain a little clearer, basically what Kool Herc did was he noticed that when he would play records at parties, there were certain portions of certain songs that people, you know, like the crowd really responded to. You know, maybe there was cheering or like dancing particularly hard or whatever. And he was noticing that, right? And those are called breaks. So a break is when people stop singing and there's just like an instrumental section of a song, right? So what did he do? Well, he would buy a second copy of a record with a song with a good break in it, and he'd also get a second record player. And he would basically like so if you've ever seen a record is basically one continuous groove that kind of spirals from the edge to the middle. So basically what he would do, he would like literally visually identify where that interesting break part was and figure out how long it was, and he would play it on one record player, and then while it was playing he would use what's called a fader, or which is basically you can see this little knob right here. You switch the knob back and forth, so you switch it to the left and this record player is playing through the speakers. You switch it to the right, this record player is playing through the speakers, right? And also, if you've seen like, you know, DJs before we had laptops, which can automate all this stuff, you know, a little easier. If you've seen like old school DJs, they'll often have a pair of headphones on with one ear on and one ear off, right? So one ear is listening to what the crowd is listening to, the other ear is listening to what the other record player is playing. So as the break of the song is playing, he would cue up that same break on this record. As the break ended, he would switch over and play the break on this record. While this break was playing, he would cue it up on this record player. And then as this one ended, he would switch back over and go on and on and on and on and on. You know, this is a difficult task, but the more he practiced it, the better he got. And eventually he was so good at this that he started previewing this at parties. And again, there's a competitive economic aspect to this, right? The better DJs are making more money. So very quickly, Kool Herc becomes one of the most popular DJs in the South Bronx because of this little trick that he's doing. So to kind of further illustrate this, I'm just going to play like a little chunk of a particular break from this particular record that was really popular, that Kool Herc in particular popularized. Again, I'm just going to play a little like 10-second snippet of the break. And as I'm playing it, imagine it looping and looping and looping and looping again as he's queuing this record up and playing it on one, playing it on the other, playing it on the one, going back and forth. Okay, I think it's important for your notes. So here is what Kool Herc did. DJ Kool Herc switched between two records to extend the break, the exciting instrumental part of a song, right? Very simple trick. However, a simple trick that sparked an entire global movement, right? This is the big bang of hip hop, innovatively using records to make new music. Now, at the time, some people, you know, especially to be blunt, kind of white people who thought hip hop was not real music, criticized early hip hop. It's like, well, you're just talking over other people's records. That's not real music. Well, you know, again, I think that's a really unfair and kind of absurd viewpoint to take, especially given the fact that this whole musical form exists because, again, poor kids were using what little they had to make something completely new. And I think it's really fascinating and something to be celebrated. DJ Kool Herc was not the only game in town, right? And other DJs, I think in particular Grandmaster Flash, took what Kool Herc was doing and pioneered some even more interesting and innovative DJ techniques, some of which, you know, some kind of traditionalist DJs still use to this day. So I'm going to play a clip from a movie called Wild Style. By the way, if you're a fan of early hip hop, I really recommend this movie. It's kind of cheesy, has like a cheesy low budget 1980s-ness about it. However, the reason it's, I think, a really valuable film to watch is because pretty much everybody, with the exception of like 1 or 2 people in the film, were not paid actors. They were actual members of the early hip hop community. So it is a really, you know, it has like a kind of corny storyline to it, but it is a really kind of powerful representation of early hip hop culture. Okay, it was from this cultural milieu that breakdancing appears. Now, there's a long tradition in kind of urban Black America of street dancing, so this was not a new thing. However, what was new was the kind of particular forms and styles of dancing that emerged kind of along with hip hop culture. And again, why are they called breakdancers? Well, there are different theories. I think the one that makes the most sense is that they're dancing to the break of the song, right? Again, Kool Herc, other DJs are extending the break. It's kind of like creating, you know, using records to like create this kind of open space for other people, creative people to come along and add things into that open space. And one of some of the people who were doing that were breakdancers. I do want to play a clip about breakdancing. I'll just show you some of the moves, but I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause on that for now because I'm going to come back to that kind of as I'm making another point. And I want to move on to, you know, what most of you probably associate with hip hop, which is rapping, right? So believe it or not, rapping came after the whole DJ thing. The graffiti and DJing were really the first two. So where did rapping come from, or rappers or MCs? Well, DJs hired MCs, and MCs are master of ceremonies. So master of ceremonies is an old idea, you know, like master of ceremonies is the person who, like, you know, officiates a graduation or wedding ceremony or something, or I guess a wedding reception. And DJs were hiring their friends basically to get up on the microphone and work the crowd, right? So early hip hop shows, when you went to an early hip hop show, you didn't go to see the MC, you went to see the DJ. The DJ was the central thing. Maybe there's some breakdancing crews as well, kind of in the mix. But again, when you went to early hip hop shows, the DJ was the main draw. And the MC was just kind of like someone that they would pay to kind of hype the crowd up. However, you know, eventually, as you know, the MC would kind of overtake the DJ because, well, why? Well, they chanted call and response rhymes, which eventually grew into its own art form, rapping.
Somebody, anybody, help me scream! Now, I run New York City all years around. My name is known all over the town. The boy, people here love the way I run my game. They can't wait to see me make a hell of a sound. Mr. is my name, and that's the fact. And you can't be that with a stick for a bat. Now, I walk around and slide in the beat. In the MC world, there's no better than me. Man, I'm better than Bo, bolder than bad. The best MC like ever had. When I came to Earth, by the meteorite, they didn't wanna give me a try, but they heard my voice could make your dance, so they finally bailed out, gave me a chance. Then I rocked the house so viciously, all the girls just talking about the bitch that beats to this town. Stop that messing around because I'm busy in your pop. I said being an MC just wasn't my choice, but soon found out I had to go to this voice. I was too hot to handle to stole the hole because MC stand for mic control. When it came to that, I was one of the best. Like a robbing on south, the east and west. I'm like Mickey Mouse and the son of Sam. When I shot the house, don't give a damn. When I was walking through the jungle Sitting by my car, take lots of heed to these words I say. Got people entertaining, ain't giving on the way. It's like that, y'all, and you don't stop. You keep on, keep the ground gone.
Now, lest we forget the context amidst all of this fun and partying, you know, gangs were a very, very powerful thing in South Bronx in the 1970s during the hip hop era. And in fact, there were some people who basically left gangs to become part of the hip hop movement. And early hip hop, you know, one of the ways early hip hop kind of reflects its culture of, you know, again, racialized poverty, was that you had kind of gangs of hip hop artists, right? So in other words, for the most part, there were not individual breakdancers, there were breakdancing crews. You know, there were individual graffiti artists, but graffiti artists also would often run in crews, you know, groups that were often like competing with other graffiti artists. And I'll you know, I don't know if that makes any sense. You can kind of Google that if you're not sure. You know, breakdancing was often competitive. MCing was often competitive. There were different MC crews. You know, as MCing becomes more and more of a thing that replaces the kind of eclipses the DJs, there were like battles, right? Where different MC crews would get up and the crowd would decide who won. And again, this is unsurprising that early hip hop was competitive because gangs were competitive, right? And so again, for a lot of people, hip hop was a way to escape the gangs. And in fact, that is what happened for a lot of young folks living in the South Bronx. And to show this, I'm going to play a clip from a movie called Beat Street. So I really recommend Wild Style. Beat Street, I don't recommend. It's a really bad, cheesy movie that does not represent early hip hop culture very well. It's not an accurate representation of early hip hop. It's a little too glitzy. There's too many white people in the crowd. However, the young men, and it's all men, unfortunately, the young men in this clip were actual breakdancers from the actual South Bronx. And this clip, I think, demonstrates the ways that different breakdancing crews were competing with each other, and the crowd would decide basically who won, right? So let's check this out. Okay, I want to make one more point about hip hop before we wrap up. Early hip hop is kind of known for being kind of like, lighthearted and celebratory, and the lyrics are not very deep or consequential, like hard hitting. However, that changed pretty early on. In 1982, a group called Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Fives. We already saw Grandmaster Flash, so again, he had an MC crew, which eventually kind of eclipsed him in popularity. So Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five put out a song called "The Message." I don't have a date here. I believe it's 1982. And it's largely considered kind of the first really truly political hip hop song. Today we have Kendrick Lamar, we have Logic, right? We have all these artists that people know and love who use their hip hop platforms to make political points. And they pretty much have this song to thank. And again, I'm showing this picture here because this is what this song is about, right? This song is a very gritty, I would even say very disturbing, almost kind of like urban newsreel of what it was like living in the South Bronx at this point in the 1980s. So it was 1982 when the song came out. So a few points about the song before I play the music video. It is very gritty. It is very depressing. There's not a lot of hope in here. And it's also kind of, well, it's not kind of, it is homophobic in parts. So it really wasn't, until a few years ago that it became okay to be gay in hip hop. And unfortunately for most of hip hop's history, hip hop has been known, and I think justly so, as one of the most homophobic American music genres. And unfortunately, this song is going to reflect that. However, I think this song is still really important, historically important, and really offers a very unsparing, unsentimental glimpse into what it was like living in the South Bronx in the 1980s. And I think it's a perfect song to end on to illustrate some of my points I'm trying to make.
Broken glass everywhere. People on the stage, they just don't care. I can't take the smell, can't take the noise. Got no money to move out, I guess I got no choice. Rats in the front room, roaches in the back, junkies in the alley with the baseball bat. I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far, cause a man with a tow truck repossessed my car. Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. Standing on the front stoop, hanging out the window, watching all the cars go by, roaring as the breezes blow. A crazy lady living in a bag, eating out of garbage pails, used to be a fag hag, such a dance to tango, skip the life and dango. A zircon princess seemed to lost her senses, down at the peep show, watching all the creeps, so she could tell her stories to the girls back home. She went to the city and got so did it. She had to get a pimp, she couldn't make it on her own. Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
My brother's doing fast on my mother's TV. Says she watches too much, it's just not healthy. All my children in the daytime, Dallas at night. Can't even see the game or the Sugar Ray fight. The bill collectors, they ring my phone and scare my wife when I'm not home. Got a bum education, double-digit inflation. Can't take the train to the job, there's a strike at the station. Neon King Kong standing on my back, can't stop to turn around. Broke my sacroiliac, a mid-range migraine, cancer membrane. Sometimes I think I'm going insane, I swear I might hijack a plane. Don't push me, call, I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. My son said, Daddy, I don't want to go to school, cause the teacher's a jerk, he must think I'm a fool. And all the kids smoke reefer, I think it'd be cheaper if I just got a job, learn to be a street sweeper. I dance to the beat, shuffle my feet, wear a shirt and tie, and run with the creeps. Cause it's all about money, ain't a damn thing funny. You got to have a con in this land of milk and honey. They pushed that girl in front of the train, took her to the doctor, sewed her arm on again. Stabbed that man right in his heart. Gave him a transplant for a brand new start. I can't walk through the park cause it's crazy after dark. Keep my hand on my gun cause they got me on the run. I feel like an outlaw, broke my last glass jaw. Hear them say, you want some more? Living on a seesaw. Don't push me cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. Say what? It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. A child is born with no state of mind, blind to the ways of mankind. God is smiling on you, but he's frowning too, because only God knows what you'll go through. You'll grow in the ghetto, living second rate, and your eyes will sing a song of deep hate. The places you play and where you stay looks like one great big alleyway. You'll admire all the number book takers, thugs, pimps, and pushers, and the big money makers, driving big cars, spending 20s and 10s, and you wanna grow up to be just like them. Smugglers, scramblers, burglars, gamblers, pickpocket peddlers, even panhandlers. You say I'm cool, I'm no fool, but then you wind up dropping out of high school. Now you're unemployed, all non-void, walking around like your pretty boy Floyd. Turned stick-up kid, but look what you done did. Got sent up for an 8-year bid. Now your manhood is took and you're a Maytag. Spend the next 2 years as an undercover fag, being used and abused to serve like hell. Till one day you was found hung dead in a cell. It was plain to see that your life was lost. You was cold and your body swung back and forth. But now your eyes sing the sad, sad song of how you live so fast and die so young. So don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
Yo, Mel, you see that girl, man? Yeah, man. Yo, that sound like Cowboy, man. Yo, what's up, money? Yo. Hey, where's Creole and Rock?
Okay, I just like you to get some notes down, kind of putting together some of the things I've said, and then we're going to end pretty soon, and I'll have you do one more post at the end. So hip-hop grew directly out of ghettoized poverty, right? The way hip-hop formed, the way it was shaped, is completely unintelligible unless you understand the context of ghettoized poverty, right? So point number one, 4 points. It was a music culture formed out of stuff lying around, right? Records, microphones, cardboard, spray paint cans, right? This was people who didn't have much, who were taking that little that they didn't have and making something beautiful and celebratory out of it. Parties allowed DJs and MCs to make money in a place of high unemployment. So again, there was an economic incentive. So yes, it was fun, it was lighthearted, it was a way to escape the realities of your environment, but it was also a way for some people to make money. Even graffiti, there was a short period where like the art world discovered graffiti, and graffiti artists like making paintings, selling paintings to white people living up in Manhattan and stuff. So there was a financial incentive behind early hip hop culture. Hip hop crews, all right, made this point, but I want you to get in your notes. Groups of MCs, dancers, etc., grew out of the gang model. Shows hosted competitive battles. So again, and this happens to this day. There are some hip hop artists who, will do freestyle battles where there'll be like a moderator or a DJ playing beats, and they'll take turns freestyling, making up rhymes off the top of their head, and the crowd decides who wins, right? So some aspects of these traditions are still around. And last point, I think this is so important to understand. The joyfulness of early hip hop was a defiant response to horror and hopelessness. I think especially an important point because I know, if I could be a grumpy old man for a second, a lot of younger people, and there's been some memes about this in the past few years, hear early hip hop and just like, oh my God, that is so corny, right? Like it sounds so primitive, and like it's kind of like, the rhymes of early hip hop, it's kind of sing-songy, and feels kind of silly compared to where hip hop is now. However, like if you think that, I want you to banish that thought from your head. The kind of silly, happy, kind of joyfulness of early hip hop, I almost would say was like a political response, right? It was like, okay, we are living in rubble and destruction and terror and death and murder, but we're going to celebrate and dance in the face of all of that anyway, right? And just me personally, I think this is why hip hop culture has caught on so much globally, because all over the world, there are poor, disadvantaged, marginalized people struggling in ways that most Americans could never imagine. And hip hop just makes sense to them, right? It just connects with them in a way that other forms of global pop music don't. And I understand why. It's because of this, right? I mean, this is why. So let's wrap up and respond. Post a signed response to one of the following questions. I have 2 questions for you. So this one's more focusing on the Unfair Housing Act's article. And this is actually a question the article ended on. I'm curious to hear what you think. If the federal government played an outsized role in segregating the suburbs, should the government play a role in current desegregation efforts? There are a lot of people who say, oh, this is terrible history, but oh no, don't do anything about it now. I'm happy with the suburbs now, right? So why? Should the government get involved? Why not? And what should or shouldn't be done? Next point is about hip hop. So hip hop culture emerged from the most notoriously poor and abandoned ghetto of 1970s America. How does understanding hip hop's roots reshape or inform your understanding of the current state of hip hop culture in the U.S. and abroad? So it's a very open-ended question. Maybe you're happy with the current state of hip hop, maybe you're not. Regardless, maybe you're somewhere in between. How does understanding its roots help you understand where hip hop is today? As usual, looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And that is all I have for today. Have a good day, and I will see you again with. I'm really bad at ending things. Let me just stop talking.